Technology works. All right, great. As Chris said, I'm Tim LeMaster. I'm the lead senior iOS developer here at Resource Ammirati. That's not quite right. And IBM company. So exciting news, we were purchased by IBM. I want to throw that in there. I'm going to do a talk on introduction to native iOS for developers and designers. So I'm going to try to keep it at a really high level. I'm going to touch on some development work, some designer's work. I am a developer, so if I say something wrong on the design side, I'm not a designer. If I say something wrong on the development side, then I just don't know what I'm talking about. And the subtitle is, how do you like them apples? So yeah, let's get going on that. First of all, what we want to do is define really what we're talking about. And the easiest way to do that is to talk about, what is native, what's a web app, and what is hybrid. So a native development, and in the terms of iOS, is developing, code specifically for the device using, Apple's tools or third-party tools to produce compiled code that gets shipped to the App Store and approved by Apple, and then eventually, goes worldwide on their store. Conversely, web development would be developing, using your typical web development tools, JavaScript, HTML, maybe some backend stack, Node, Java, whatever have you, and then publishing that on, the World Wide Web, and then that's available via your browser. And obviously, if you're going on a phone, you're probably going to do like a responsive website so it looks good, but Apple's not in the mix here at all. You can put anything you want, and it's available via Safari. Kind of bringing those two things together would be like a hybrid app. Your typical hybrid app is compiled and sent to the App Store and contains, some of those SDK components, but then a lot of it's built with many times web development tools, right? So you've got HTML in there, you've got JavaScript in there, and a lot of your user interface may be presented that way. And that can be done either kind of shipped with the application, or your application might actually reach out and pull in more HTML, more JavaScript from the web as it's like kind of running. And I just wanted to point out that's the differences. And we're going to talk about native iOS. We could spend all day long on the differences between those and why you might choose those for one project or another. And maybe I'll do a talk on that, or somebody else can do a talk on that. But tonight we're just going to talk about native iOS development. So I think we covered that. Moving on. So yeah, tonight we're going to talk about native iOS only. But I want to talk about some of the advantages and then conversely some of the disadvantages with native iOS. So what I see as the kind of three major advantages is performance, access to device capabilities, and then offline capabilities. In the performance arena, right, native iOS is going to have much, much smoother animations, be much more responsive to your users' interactions on the screen. And at the same time as they have that extra performance, it's going to get better battery life. A lot of people have published like either responsive web apps or hybrid apps and then actually switched over to native. LinkedIn, Facebook, these guys have developed hybrid apps and then discovered that they weren't very pleasing to their users. And mostly it was about that responsive, about that animation, being smooth, being fast, really feeling fluid on the devices. Another company did a really cool app, mobile first, called Flipboard. And really smooth animations, really, really cool looking app. And they wanted to bring that to the web. What they found is that the web browser, the typical tools for that just weren't fast enough with the animations. And they kind of ditched, I'm going to use a complex word here called a DOM, if you don't know what that is. That's a document object model. That's kind of how you build your web page. They kind of ditched that whole thing and wrote to another complex word here, Canvas, which is kind of a graphics thing for the web. Wrote to that directly to get kind of approach that performance that a native app would have, and that's on a desktop browser. So building with hybrid or responsive websites, while they can be quick and easy, they're not going to have that performance that a native app will give you. Another thing is device capability. So these tools we hold in our hands are really like super powerful. It's kind of amazing. We've got like Touch ID. We've got thumbprint sensors. I said Touch ID. I meant Force Touch, 3D Touch, right? So we've got all these cool stuff built in. And to their credit, web apps and hybrid apps are digging at these things and they're getting access to them. But the native always kind of has the edge, right? So as Apple's producing these new technologies, they're working on the SDKs, handing us to us, the developers. We're seeing those in beta releases. We're trying to come up with new cool uses for those, and we're getting those to market as fast as possible. the hybrid guys, the web guys who are building those toolkits to build these apps are doing the same thing, but they're always going to kind of lag behind just a little bit, and we're just going to have a little edge. So if you're doing something like super cutting edge, you probably want to look at native to get to those, you know, capabilities faster and better. Another thing is your offline capabilities, right? So users expect most apps to work very, very well offline, seamlessly, right? If you don't have a connection right then, the app still works. Of course, it can't get new data. It can't like send a tweet right then, but you can see, you know, what the app was kind of last time it was able to get new data. Native guys do a pretty good job with this. I mean, sometimes we fall down, but and some apps don't really need that offline. But your typical web app, there are ways to make it available offline, but it's not being done as often, and it's really falling down on that offline access. And even hybrid apps, where you would think they would kind of be more towards the native side of that, tend to suffer with offline access. I was looking at an app the other day that was built with Xamarin, which is a common hybrid tool. I don't know if anyone's built any hybrid web apps, but that's a real common one. And of course, it can work well offline, but these developers kind of had fallen down on their job. And if you launch the app in offline mode, it just kind of sat there and looked at you. And even worse, if you were online and came back to the app as it was running, anything you did just like popped up a terrible error message like right in your face, just a big stack trace. It was a mess. You typically don't see that kind of thing in a native app, which is, you know, a good reason to go that way. But there are, you know, disadvantages to native iOS development. Big one here is discovery and installation, right? So Apple hasn't done much, even since the App Store came out, to help with discovery of native apps. There's 1.5+ million apps in the App Store now, and it's really hard to get noticed. If you're not one of these, either like big player that people already know, or you don't get picked up on kind of the viral, you know, Flappy Bird momentum, you kind of just sit there and languish down at the bottom of the charts, and nobody knows who you are, nobody downloads you. It's really a winner and a loser type store. It's bad, it's hard, it's tough to fight against it. And some of these apps that languish at the bottom are either, you know, poor clones or just poor quality, right? But some of them are. There's some great apps out there that most people have never heard of and will never download and just will never be discovered. So that's a tough one if you don't have a big marketing budget or anything like that. On top of that, you've got to get people to install your app. There's barriers there. If you're expecting people to pay for your app, freemium kind of wins the day here, right? So if your app's 99 cents or even $1.99, people just like, some reason, $2 is kind of a like, what? You want $2 from me? But they'll go spend, you know, $5 at Starbucks like that. You get a whole app for $2, but that's too much. It's kind of interesting. So freemium kind of wins the day here, especially if you look at games. They're free to play, a lot of microtransactions going on. I'll talk about that in a minute. Another thing is maintenance, right? So Apple is a super innovative company. They had an event earlier this week, kind of a smaller event, but still a couple new devices, a lot of new things on the device, night shift mode, other things going on. And you got to keep up with that. Sometimes they introduce massive sweeping changes like iOS 7, which changed the entire look and feel of the device. And all of us developers were scrambling to get to that new native look and feel as fast as possible, even though they kind of supported the old Chrome, you know, there for a while. If you didn't switch over, your app felt dated immediately. And so there's a big maintenance effort to move into that iOS 7 and get that new Chrome and really make your app look cool. A lot of changes went into that. Another thing, App Store restrictions, right? There's certain things you cannot do in the App Store, and if you want to go in the App Store, you have to play by Apple's rules. This is going to apply to hybrid apps too, right? They're going to get compiled and shipped to the App Store. Apple's going to look at that. Big one is in-app purchases, right? If you're selling anything digital in your app, a book, any kind of download, movies, music, what have you, that has to be done through an in-app purchase. You can't sell via another channel, you can't get a credit card, anything like that has to go through an in-app purchase. There are ways around this, right? There is a Kindle app. You can download your books to your phone. There is a Comixology app. I read comic books. I don't know if anybody else reads comic books. I think it's almost cool now with all the movies coming out, but I read comic books. There's a Comixology app, and Amazon actually bought that company. Same problem. Before Amazon purchased them, you could buy the comics in the app. Apple was taking a 30% cut of all that. Amazon's like, hey, we don't want to give Apple 30% of every sale here. So that behavior died. But to get that app published, they have to sever all the links between the app and the website. If you go to the Kindle app and open it up, there's no way to press a button and get to the bookstore, right? Apple will not publish that app that way. So there's workarounds, but if you're a smaller guy and you've got an app like that, are people really going to discover that connection on their own? They're going to download this app. It's not going to have any content in it. How do I get content? So you either got to play the in-app purchase route, or you got to figure out how to get people to make that link. It's pretty easy for Amazon, not so easy for a guy like me. Another thing, development cost versus audience, right? If you're doing a native iOS app, chances are you might need a native Android app. Even if you've got both of those, you might need a responsive web app for people who aren't going to download your app, or you at least need a website that supports it. So you're developing, 3 times versus if you did something like a responsive web app, you might just do it once. And your audience might accept that. That might be good for the marketplace you're in. You need to research this, see what users expect, right? There's markets that users expect a native app. It's just kind of table stakes at this point. If you're a bank, for instance, right? Everyone expects their bank to have a nice mobile app. I can scan my check. I can check my balances. I can do transfers. And if you went to a bank and they didn't have a mobile app, you'd be like, really? Right? It's just kind of table stakes. So you got to look at, what's the audience expect? What can you support on your development? And go from there. But native's probably going to be the most expensive option of all the 3 options we were talking about. This is kind of my strategy by category. This is backed by a little bit of research on what's going on in the marketplace, but this is just what I think. So games are a vast portion of the store. They're about 20% of the app store, but the competition is really, really fierce here, right? Like I said before, freemium rules the day. If people haven't heard of your name as a publisher, if you're not like Square or somebody, or haven't had a previous hit like Flappy Bird, they're probably not going to pay for your app. So if you make it free, in-app purchase dominates. You can do in-app purchases that are like one-time purchases, more levels. You can do in-app purchases, and this is really how people make their money, is kind of that usable up item, right? You get more lives, and you can play for 20 minutes, and if you lose all those lives, you got to wait for 20 more minutes until you get more lives, or you pay them, 99 cents for 5 more lives. That's really how people are making real money with games. There are exceptions to that, right? So Square is converting all like the Final Fantasy apps to native, and they're charging, I don't know, 15, 10 bucks for those. But people know that publisher, people know those games, and they're willing to pay for them. If they don't know you, it's tough. Shopping and marketing, this is kind of where I play a lot of my day during the day. So it's vast, right? It's 10% of the App Store, which is amazing. When the App Store started, it was not like this at all. But shopping and marketing came along. Every brand is pushing into this space because they're all fighting to stay alive, fighting to be relevant, fighting to get into your workflow. So they're not going to install, your users aren't going to install every brand that they interact with. You got to deliver something special here. You have to really provide something more than your website does, and something that drives your user to actually want to use and install that app. And of course, without any saying, these apps have to be free, right? You're advertising to your user is essentially what it is. You're putting advertisement on their device. It's got to be free. And it's got to really offer that cool value. Productivity and utilities app. This kind of varies by what the utility does, and it's not a huge portion of the store, which is kind of surprising to me. And you might find a niche here. It's about 5% of the app store by category. Many of these are free, but super high quality apps can charge really even a monthly or a yearly fee. If you think about Dropbox or Evernote, you can get real money here. You can charge users, and users are willing to pay for it. But it's got to be that super premium product, right? It's got to automatically sync up with multiple devices. It needs to be available on every platform and on the web and all that kind of stuff. It really needs to be that premium experience if you're going to charge real money for it. And then social. Surprisingly to me, it's only about 2% of the App Store by category, so kind of low marketplace. But this is really tied to what social platform do they use in their daily life already, right? They're not going to download your social platform if they're kind of not already established. If Twitter, Facebook, whatever they use is the apps they're going to install and use on a daily basis. So these are free, almost typically. Ad supported, right? That's how Facebook makes money. That's how Twitter makes money. That's how everybody makes money in this space. There are people that you might consider like a social network who are collecting money from users, but they're selling something, right? You've got Fandango that sells tickets, and they've got social aspects in there, getting people to interact with movies and do of that nature, and kind of trying to make it a little more social, try to get people back. But they're selling a physical product. They're not selling the app or anything. Same thing with like Groupon and things of those nature, right? So they might have social aspects to them, but they're selling something physical if they're getting money. So we've kind of talked about what is native and advantages, disadvantages. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about working with native iOS. A little bit from developers and a little bit for designers. I'm a developer by trade, so might be a little heavier there. I'm going to talk about tools. So first off, Xcode, right? This is the official Apple tool for developing iOS applications and anything else on their platform. It's totally free. It does everything, right? So beginners, this is where you want to start. You can go to Apple and you can download Xcode. It's right on the App Store. You can install it. You can start writing apps. You can build an entire app, start to finish, just using Xcode. And it has tools for doing your source code editing, whether that be Swift or Objective-C. Those are kind of the two languages you can use. It also has tools for building storyboards, which are your user interface in kind of a WYSIWYG format, and you can connect buttons to actions, and you can connect other views to other views and make transitions between them, and you can do that in kind of a visual format. And then it contains some specialty editors for stitching your application together to say like, okay, what's the icon, what's the launch file, and a bunch of little specialty tools in there. And it's really cool, and it's great. Some developers who've been around for a while kind of find the text editing a little lacking, right? So it doesn't have really awesome refactoring. It does have it for Objective-C. It doesn't have it at all for Swift at this moment. And it's a little lacking on maybe hotkeys and really powerful text editing. And that's kind of where AppCode comes in. So AppCode's an editor from the JetBrains guys. They make a really great IDE for editing your source files for Objective-C and Swift. It's got really, really powerful editing and refactoring built in, but it doesn't have everything else that you need, right? It's not trying to be your visual editor. It's not trying to be all your specialty property editors. If your workflow includes AppCode, you're going to be back and forth between AppCode and Xcode, and that's fine. I've worked with a lot of developers who use AppCode. If you're developing for iOS, you want to know that it's out there. You'll probably end up working with a developer who's using it. It'll all work nicely together, but just realize that it's out there. And then something I think is really cool is an application called PaintCode. If you're developing, especially if you're working with your designer, you're developing really, really cool user interfaces. You want those not just to be based on static JPEGs, PNGs, whatever have you. You want those to be nice and fluid. You want them to animate nice. You want them to respond to user touches with animations. PaintCode can turn vector drawings into code. So your designer, in theory, could draw something in PaintCode. It will generate either Objective-C or Swift, depending on what you tell it to do, you can then paste that into Xcode as a view, and it will render what they drew on screen. And since it's based on a vector drawing, you can make those, excuse me, you can make those controls resizable. You can build in parameters that can also even change how that control is rendered. You could build a gauge, right? If you imagine a gauge with a needle face, if you did this with an image, you might have a background of the gauge and you might have an image that's the needle, and then you might write some code to stitch those together that changes the angle of that needle in the face, and you might wrap that all up, and that might work pretty good. It wouldn't be super resizable, right? Because you're dealing with a static image, and you'd write a lot of code to deal with those angles and deal with those edge cases of how far you can move it. You could actually do that all in PaintCode, and that angle could be a parameter that goes into that view that says, hey, where do you want this gauge face to be angled? And you wouldn't have written a line of code for that. You could drop that into a custom control and then drop that into your application and use that. So super, super powerful for really complex UI applications. It's hard to, in code, draw complex paths. And really, you're going to import images, or you're going to do a lot of hand coding of, draw this box and then draw this circle. Paint code will help you do that directly by turning drawings directly into code. Another thing, common frameworks, right? So iOS is loaded with all these frameworks that will help you build your applications much, much faster and give you access to all the powerful features on those devices. This is something I love about the language versus a lot of other things. These are built right in. All you got to do is link them, add them to your project, and you've got access to them. You've got things for locating the user, putting maps on the screen, working with databases, manipulating images, core graphics and core image, stuff to do animation, do really, really sweet, smooth animations, access the user's photos. Just all this stuff is built in, waiting there for you to use. And you want to pay attention and really dive into the platform and see, what do I get out of the box and what can it do for me? How do I interact with these, common frameworks? So speaking of that, speaking of those common frameworks, this is kind of stuff that I think I learned over my career working with iOS. I think I've been working with iOS almost since the SDK came out. And I think I learned a few hard lessons. Number one, don't fight the framework. So those frameworks are there. The Apple engineers made them to work, in a specific manner. You might, a lot of developers are like, hey, I know what I'm doing. I'm just going to bang away and kind of do things the way I want to do. But really read the documentation, understand how they're meant to be used. Product I used to work on in a previous job, there was a framework being used to present the user with some input. And that's really an asynchronous flow, right? The application is going to ask for input, but it's not going to know when that input's going to come back. It's really like making a network call, right? You don't know when that's going to happen. And Apple's really designed that to be asynchronous. Well, the developers found some code on the internet that kind of crammed that into a synchronous flow, but to keep the kind of application just from freezing as they waited for that input, they spun that, I'm going to use a complex word here, run loop, which is the processing of user input and network input. They kind of spun that themselves internally and then responded to that. I showed this to an Apple engineer. I happened to be at WWDC, and he was horrified, right? And so I kind of dug into it a little more, and it was causing some really weird crashes in our application. It was eating battery life, and it was just doing nasty, nasty things to our app. So I ripped all that out, and Apple engineers were probably much happier with us. Another thing is use storyboards. I talked about these a little earlier, right? So storyboards are super cool. You can design your user interface right in kind of WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get a little bit. And you can link from one view to another and kind of build your application flow. You can drop buttons and views on here, and you can wire those back to their view controllers. And Apple's making this more and more powerful every Xcode release, every iOS release. So make sure you use these. I think, when this stuff first started coming out, some developers were kind of hesitant. Oh, I'm going to build everything in code. I'm going to lay out my views in code. I'm super hardcore. But this is really super powerful stuff, and you can develop things very, very rapidly, and it's really super cool. However, break them up, right? So this is a real example I found somewhere of this is a storyboard that is an entire application in one storyboard file, and it's like a crazy mess. For one, you open this, you don't even know where to look, and for two, this is all in one giant XML file. So for those of you familiar with editing and maybe familiar with XML, this is a nightmare for your source code control. If somebody makes a change to this and somebody, I want to change this view and somebody else wants to change that view, we're changing the same file. So every little interface change is going to be affecting the same file. This is not good. Might get away with this if you're working by yourself, but even just dealing with this open all at once at one time is kind of insane. There's really good tools to break your storyboard files up. In iOS 9, you can even drag and drop and make a storyboard reference and say, oh, if the user clicks this button, transition to this whole other storyboard. Break these things up, turn them into applications flow. You might have a login flow. You might have a, I want to read a message flow. You might have to flow to view unread messages. Whatever your application does, figure out those flows, break those up into those things. If you're only iOS 9, use those storyboard references. If you're previous to iOS 9, there's ways to do this in code that are really, really simple. So make sure you break these things up. And learn auto layout and size classes. So auto layout is defining rules to determine the size and position of anything on the screen, right? So you would write a rule to determine the position of this button, maybe in reference to this edge, and maybe in reference to this bottom edge, or maybe in reference to this other view. But you write rules that say, how big should I be? Where should I be? And you do that for every component on the screen. And that way it can adapt to various screen sizes. Now we have various sized iPhones. People are developing on iPad and sharing those user interfaces across both of them. And to help out with that, they're using size classes. Apple introduced size classes, which define basically for each axis. So your X and your Y axis will define either it's normal sized or it's compact. So if you turn a phone sideways, it might be compact in that orientation. And you can write rules that will adjust the position of things based on whether it's compact or not. So this is a game I'm working on. It uses size classes and auto layout. It's the same storyboard file for iPad and iPhone, and it just adjusts to its size based on auto layout, and then it adjusts the position of some things using size classes. So like this button and those scores in a compact height, I don't really have room to put those on top of the board, so I move them to the size, and that's done with a size class rule. So make sure you learn that stuff. Super, super critical to support all the different devices and really have a good experience for your users. And on top of that, make custom controls. This is a control that I made the other day, not too long ago, that's like a stop button, but it's like for a jogging type application, and your user who's jogging might be trying to mess with the volume, might be trying to do something else. He doesn't want to stop the music just because his hand brushes on it. So what this is designed to do is you have to hold it down to stop, right? To hold it down for a certain amount of time. There's a lot of different ways this could be done. You could do this with images, you could do this with a timer, and stitch all this stuff together. But this is a subclass of UI control, which is the kind of base class for making controls like that. And all of this done with code. It's pretty simple, looking control, but it's all done with code. There's an animation that starts when the user kind of touches down, and then the animation is interrupted when they touch up. And then if the animation fully completes, it actually sends a custom event that says, hey, the button was pressed long enough. And this is only about 200 lines of code. To do all of the drawing and reacting to those events and everything. So learn how to make custom controls. Your designers are going to love it because they're going to design really cool looking stuff. But if you don't implement it to be nice and smooth and animate, then it's just not going to be all that it can be. Speaking of your designers doing cool stuff, or you designers out there, let's talk a little bit about designing for iOS. So the human interface guidelines, that's kind of your Bible for designing for iOS. It's going to offer you a lot of information about how Apple expects you to design your applications. They're going to, give you advice on how they see navigation working, right? How you move from one view to another, what people are expecting. They're going to talk about what the available components are, your split view controllers, navigation controllers, and they're going to give you an idea, even at a kind of a non-technical look of it, of how to stitch together an application using their stuff. So that's going to make your developer's life easier, and he's going to like you because you're going to say, oh, I know how this is supposed to work. I know how Apple expects us to put it together. Let's do that way. They're also going to define icons, sizes, image sizes, formats they support, all that stuff that you're going to need to know to give the assets that you're going to need in your application. And then they're going to describe the technologies that are available in the phones or the iPads. What can it do, right? What can that Touch ID sensor do? What can that Force Touch do? What can in-app purchase do? What can all these really, really cool technologies do? A lot of that's in here. You want to spend time going through this. And it's great if the designer and the developer, if you're working with a designer and a developer, kind of have this as the base knowledge. And you kind of know what each other are talking about when you're talking about these common things, and then you understand when maybe one of you is going outside the box. And going outside the box is fine, but you want to do it purposefully, right? You want your application to work the way users expect apps to work, and then maybe you've got a really cool idea like, oh, I don't know, pull to refresh. Does anybody know where pull to refresh came from? It came from Tweety, I believe, which was a kind of unofficial Twitter client, and it was really cool interaction, right? So Apple had the table view kind of bounce at the top, just to let you know, hey, you're at the top. The application isn't frozen. The guys writing Tweety were like, hey, maybe the user intent is I do want to see more. So they made this kind of pull to refresh control, get me more data, and everybody loved it. Apple finally built that in as a standard control. So it's great to go outside the box, and you may introduce something really, really cool in the community and they pick it up. But if your application doesn't work, kind of normally besides that, people aren't going to notice that like maybe one or two subtle cool things that you built in. If it does a bunch of other crazy stuff they don't expect, right? To help you with that, right? Facebook's got these really, really awesome iOS 9 templates. They spent a lot of time on these, right? It contains examples of almost every element in iOS 9. They went through and literally recreated these so that they could give them away, right? So the actual implementations are Apple's property, but Facebook went through and recreated these things. They provided them in Photoshop and Sketch templates. There's kind of a light version, which is kind of the common components that most apps use, and then there's like a really full version that's literally everything they could find in iOS 9. They went and pulled all the assets out and recreated them. Really, really awesome resource. It's also got additional stuff in there that's not just in iOS 9, but to help you make maybe great presentations for your design. They've got, like hands holding phones, so you could take that and you could crop your awesome, cool design in there and put it in your presentation. And they've got device outlines for all the various devices that you could, use to mock things up. Really, really awesome resource for Photoshop and Sketch. And Sketch is a really cool tool. That's kind of, I think it's Mac only, but it's really targeted at designing for native iOS. It can do a lot of other things, but they've got tools to export your assets in the various sizes and scales that you need for devices. A really cool workflow for doing that. And just a super awesome tool. I know Columbus Web Group has a video, I think, on YouTube. They did a workshop on this, so you can watch it on Sketch 3. Super, super awesome. Any designer who hasn't kind of played around with it, I definitely recommend with it. Super, super cool. What else? All right, custom. All right, so here, image formats. So you're going to be designing, right, in Photoshop, Sketch, whatever. You're probably using some sort of vector-based design tool, but eventually you're going to have to cut assets and deliver them to your developer. So what's that going to look like, right? You're going to mostly deliver PNGs. That's kind of the base kind of standpoint, right? It's a good trade-off between size and quality. It supports, transparency. Pretty much what Apple expects you to use. Everything's geared towards that. There are times you may want to consider JPEG though, right? JPEG can give you a smaller file that might still be good, high quality enough, but if you have like a super big image, if you want to do like a full screen image filling up the entire background of an iPad and you want to put that on the screen, you don't need the transparency. It'll be a much smaller size, and there's great support for JPEG built into iOS. Where it doesn't fall down, or where it does fall down, is kind of SVG, right? I think a lot of people are using more and more SVG on the web. Native doesn't have a lot of support for this, right? You can't just drop an SVG file in there and put it anywhere you want in your application and just have it kind of be your solution for responsive, right? So this thing's just going to get bigger and smaller depending on how big and small the screen is. Not a lot of support for it. You can drop SVGs into what would be called a web view. You'd start to be like a hybrid application at that point, right? So you're using a web technology in your app. It's great for certain things, right? You can use it for like splash screens. I've got an app that does that. It's got an SVG file embedded in a splash screen that starts up, and it's got a really cool animation. I didn't have to create that in code. A guy who does really great, awesome SVG animations did that, and I just dropped it right in. Great solution for certain things, but just it's not your kind of one-shot kill shot for doing a responsive application. And speaking of that, so how do you do that? You've got scales, right? Scales is really how many points in developer speak as I'm doing my auto layout, as I talked about earlier. So I'm determining the size and position. I'm working in points, and that's something Apple's defined as how big is this screen in points. But as you get to Retina devices and iPhone like 6 Plus is a 3x device, how many pixels represent a point? So on a standard old iPhone that most people don't have anymore, 1 pixel equaled 1 point, and we were used to that for a long, long time. Retina came around, and we had this funny little @2x thing on the back of all of our images. And we're like, what's that? Right? So that's just saying everything's doubled, the X and the Y axis. So 4 points, I'm sorry, 4 pixels is 1 point. 2 pixels, left and right, and 2 pixels up and down. And then we've got Act3X devices with like the iPhone 6s Plus. And what this is allowing the developer to do is kind of stitch my application together in kind of that 1X, but then developing, super sharp graphics and super sharp fonts that Apple's embedding that look really, really good on these really, really sharp, high DPI screens. So speaking of that, required assets, what are you going to need? Like I said, they don't really support SVG for your images, so you're going to have to develop these images in many, many different sizes. Things that you embed yourself, and then things that Apple just requires, right? You're going to have an app icon. That's going to have a lot of different sizes for various devices, iOS versions. If you support Spotlight Search, which I'll talk about here in a minute, that has an icon. I think that's up to like 4 different sizes. And a settings icon, I think that's 4 or 5 different icons. So even just your app icon, you may be producing, I don't know, what, 15 to 20 different versions of that. And that goes for a lot of these things. And if you notice, when Apple does this, you may start with a really big image, vector graphic, and you may be able to cut that to any size that you want, but does it look good, right? If you look at the settings icon on iOS, on a high quality screen, it's a gear with a lot of teeth. On a smaller screen, it's not just a cut down version of that gear, it's a gear with less teeth. So consider that in your workflow. If you want a really, really awesome looking app, you might have to think about, maybe I can't just cut this icon down from 1024 to 29 by 29 and just call it a day. I might have to craft that icon a little bit or what have you. Same goes for your launch images. Launch images show up for the first time when you launch your app for just a second. And those are required in various sizes for the various devices. Apple's helping us out now here with launch files instead of a static image. That's a storyboard file that is responsive to the device size. You can put some basic rules in there. So you might be able to do 1 launch file or maybe 2, 1 for the iPhone, 1 for the iPad, and help you out a little bit there. And then assets that go in the App Store, right? We're developing a native app. It's going to be sent to the App Store. Don't underestimate this. You don't want to get down to like last day, oh, we want to submit this. What do we need, right? You're going to need screenshots of your application, and those screenshots are not required. You have to have 1 for each device you support. So if you support iPhone and iPad, you don't have to upload every size of iPhone or every size of iPad, but you can, right? So if you want it to look 1-to-1 on the screen, you can upload it for the 5, you can upload it for the 6, you can upload it for the 6S Plus, and you can upload, I think, 5 or 6 images for each of those, and there's either 5 images and 6 devices or 6 devices and 5 images. So that's 30 images of screenshots you might need, and those are localizable. So if you support multiple languages, you can upload a version of those for every language you support. So that's 30 times the number of languages you support that you might want to upload. You don't have to upload all of those. And then app demonstration videos. That's kind of, if you have one of those, that's kind of the first thing the user sees, and that gives them a lot better view of how the app works, what it does, than just a static screenshot. Many different sizes on that also, but that is not localizable, so you'll only produce that in 1 language, and it should be your primary language, whatever that may be. But don't underestimate that in your workflow of getting this developed and published to the App Store. It can take a long time, especially the first time you do it, to get all this stuff ready. Now I wanted to talk about, I talked a lot about, what's been going on, what I've been doing, what designers have been doing for a lot of years since iOS come out. I want to spend a little time just focusing on some recent developments. Like I said before, Apple's constantly innovating. I had a talk, earlier this week about some cool new stuff. And this is some cool stuff that's come out in the last few years, right? And things you might want to consider. A lot of new devices in the past few years. We've got the Apple Watch and the Apple TV. Apple TV has been around a long time. Whole new version came out. We can write apps for it. And then the iPad Pro. All of these you can develop apps for using Xcode and Swift, which is kind of the new programming language that Apple's getting everybody to use, and is super cool. You can develop watch applications. Watch applications are interesting because they must be shipped in an iOS app, right? So you need to develop an iOS app, and then you need to develop a watch app. And when the user installs that app on their phone, it'll show up in their watch app and says, hey, do you want this to show up on your watch also? Of course, it's got a really small resolution and limited functionality, but they're adding to it every day. It's super cool. On that small resolution, there's really two sizes of watches, but unlike the iPhone, they're suggesting you develop the same content on both watch sizes because they're kind of minor differences, and just basically scale that user interface up for the larger phone or scale, or larger watch or smaller watch, scale it down, and then use that dynamic type to kind of make the font bigger. And if you've got images on there, try to do one image for both watches, because the space is really super limited, and the processor and battery and all that stuff is super limited. But really cool, awesome stuff coming out for that. Apple TV runs tvOS, but you can support a lot of the same frameworks that I talked about earlier are supported on Apple TV, and you can port your application if it's crafted well, if that code's written so there's a great separation between your UI and your logic. You can port to the Apple TV fairly easy. So you can write a Swift application for the phone. You're going to need a new user interface for the TV, and some new controls, support the remote, but pretty quick process. I know the Crossy Road guys, I don't know if anyone's played Crossy Road. It's kind of a cool little like Frogger type thing, endless jumper, really cool. They ported to the Apple TV. They had really crafted their code really well, and they ported it to it. I don't know how long it took them, but it wasn't long. They were ready to go, right there on launch day. Really super cool. The iPad Pro, it is just an iPad, right? It's just a big iPad, and now there's going to be a normal sized one, as we found out on Tuesday. It's got a bigger resolution. It does have, and I'll talk about it in a minute, it does have some new hardware that goes with it that you can take into account. And speaking of that, new capabilities. So we got new hardware. With new hardware comes new capabilities, but sometimes even old hardware gets new capabilities. Like we've got, I think, night mode now on our phones. No new device needed for that. There's some new capabilities that have come out in the past few years. Touch ID, which is fingerprint recognition built onto your phone, right? So when this first came out, this was for Apple only. It just unlocked your phone. But shortly after that, they released an SDK for it, so developers can dig at this. And there's kind of two ways to dig at this. You can do what's called local authentication. That just pops up a screen, Touch ID input screen. The thumbprint scans, and you kind of get like a yes or no. Was that thumbprint recognized as one of the thumbprints on the device, or was it not? Or there's kind of a little bit of an advanced mode, which keychain access, which is kind of cool. You can take like a username and a password, maybe to sign into your backend web service you need to talk to. You can put that in the keychain, and the keychain is that secure locker where you can store stuff like that. And then you can say, I want to lock that up with Touch ID. And so when your app goes to ask for that data back, they'll be presented with that Touch ID screen. If they scan correctly, then you'll get that key back and you'll be able to log into your back end. So really cool, easy way to build in Touch ID into your application. 3D Touch, another thing. On 6S and 6S Plus, this is not a S, so it doesn't have 3D Touch. But a force-sensitive screen, really awesome technology, and you can kind of dig at this two ways also. There's a high-level API where Apple's suggesting people do like these peeks and pops and pokes, right? So you can kind of preview email message before you read it as you like touch a little harder, or even on the home screen, the camera icon, you can hard press on that and you get kind of options. And apps can do this now too. You can add quick actions right to the home screen for your apps too. There's a API for that, so you can dig straight into a flow in your application, just like Apple does. And then you can do those peeks and pokes in your application itself. And then there's actually a low-level API that lets you dig out the force being applied. So you could use this in a game, press harder to jump higher or something like that, and you can dig at that force applied. I think someone even did like a scale for iPhone, though Apple's kind of rejecting that. I think they're worried about people maybe breaking their screens, trying to waste stuff or something. I don't know, but they don't like scales, but it is possible. And then I mentioned the iPad Pro earlier, so that's got the Apple Pencil. It doesn't come with the iPad Pro, so even if someone's on an iPad Pro, they might not have a pencil. And now there's two sizes that support the pencil, but it's a super cool piece of hardware, right? it's got a force sensor built into the tip. The iPad, the big screen, hasn't been scaled up. The 3D Touch hadn't been scaled up for a device that big. But if you use the pencil, you can get force off that, and it's got the same API for digging at those forces. But then it's also got the azimuth and the altitude of the pencil, and so the altitude is kind of the angle. Oh, look at that! Kind of the angle of the pencil, kind of up from the plane of the screen, right? And so as they tilt the pencil, you could get at, like, you know, the typical example is like the calligraphy pen, right? You start to lay the pen down, it draws thicker lines. You pick it up, it draws thinner lines, right? Really, really super cool. But you can also get at the azimuth, which is just a fancy word of the rotation of the pen about the screen. So you could make like a knob control. You could put the pencil down and you could like turn it and you can get access to that rotation data. Really, really super cool. I mentioned Spotlight earlier when I talked about icons. So you can tap into the search on the phone now. So when the user swipes down and starts entering that, stuff into that search box, your application can appear there. And the way you do that, let's say your user was using their application, and let's say it was some sort of social media app and they found one of their friends and they bookmarked their friend. You could index that in the Spotlight search. And then later, they might be searching for their friend again, just in their regular search, which would search mail and contacts and all that stuff. But your app would show up there too. Really, really super cool. So, oh yeah, Ben, I saw him in this cool social media app, and they click that, your app will be launched and given that context of what the user was searching for and says, hey, you probably want them to take to Ben's profile page or whatever your app should do when they find a user or something like that, right? So really, really super cool capabilities coming all the time. Dig into those from a design development perspective. Awesome stuff. And split screen, right? So newer iPads, iPad Pro and I don't know, Air 3 or 2 or whatever it is, and the newer iPad minis support this kind of split screen, right? So you've got in portrait mode, you've got the 60-40, and then sideways you've kind of got a 70-30 and a 50-50. This is really cool for your users because they can now finally see two apps at one time, right? They could have a mail open over here and be reading some notes from a colleague and then, you know, writing a Word document or whatever they have you in response to that, or drawing something, you know, based on the comments on that. Working with two apps at once. But your app needs to support this, right? If your app doesn't support split screen, how's the user going to feel when your app can't participate in this? And that's where auto layout and those size classes rules come in. You can't anymore with iOS say, okay, what are all the screen sizes out there? Let me just design exactly for those. It's really getting to like that responsive web type platform. Size classes is kind of breakpoints for the web. If you've done any web development, I don't know if anyone's done any web development, you have breakpoints as the browser gets less wide, it transitions to a new user interface. That's kind of what size classes is. It's kind of limited compared to that, but that's kind of what it's digging at. And so Apple's feeling like they can, kind of produce new screen sizes or these split screens, and your app should still look okay. Maybe it doesn't look super awesome because you didn't occur to you that, hey, tomorrow they introduced, a 20%, and that's like super narrow, and maybe your app doesn't look great, but it doesn't look terrible. And it's responsive to those sizes. It just doesn't try to draw itself at thinking it has the full size. So you want to think about that when you're designing these. Can you support, split screen and multiple apps at the same time? And what's that mean for your app? What should your app look like when it's over here? And maybe that's not their primary focus. They're dealing with this primarily. What can be the summary information you could, give to the user? What would be the most important thing for them to use? So just think about those kind of things. And I think, yep. So I've come to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. I talked about, kind of what is native, what is, versus hybrid versus web app. I talked about, kind of what I think of the advantages and pitfalls are. And then I talked about tools for the developer, the designer. And then I talked about some kind of recent capabilities. And I hope something in there was interesting. I hope something in there inspired you to dig into it a little more. It's a super high level overview. And I hope there's just one nugget in there that you say, oh, I want to check out split screen, or I want to check out the watch now. Anything, whatever it may be. I'm super honored and humbled to have done this. Thank you very much. And I know these guys are recording it. I've got a lot of references here on where I kind of got my statistics or whatever I referenced, or I downright just stole. Thank you very much. Yeah, and any questions, I'm happy to take, and yeah.
So my question is about workflow, development workflow. How do you handle iOS updates? So when you develop your app, so 9.3 just got released a few days ago, and it's gone through 7 betas. 9.2.1 went 2, and then 9.2 went over 4 or 5 betas.
Right.
How do you code? Do you code for do you get the most recent data and try your app and do a full regression, or do you just wait for it to go into production or just download the GM?
Yeah. So varying strategies I have on that. Of course, if you have the resources, you just want to test with everything that comes out as soon as you can. But most of us are pretty limited on the resources we have to throw at this. So as these minor release comes out, like 9.3, it's not a full, it's not 8 to 9. I try to look at, the betas they come out. They're usually pretty polished when they first come out. So install the beta, check it out, see how your app done. It's probably not going to break anything, but you might find some surprises in there. So I try to install those and work with those before it goes live. When we go from like 8 to 9, definitely want to install those ahead of time because there could be massive sweeping changes. There could be something that just totally breaks or crashes your app. I had a crash, I think, from either from 7 to 8 or 8 to 9 in one of my apps that just totally crashed. I needed to get that out there before the went live for everybody. You'll get beta users, or users who install the beta before it ever even goes live, and they will complain. You kind of got to turn a little bit of a deaf ear to that because it's like, hey, you're using a beta and my app's not ready. And then what I try to do is I install like the first beta that comes out, like iOS 9, the first beta comes out. I install and look at it, but if there's problems, I don't instantly assume it's my problem, right? This is a beta, this is an early beta. It might be a problem in iOS 9 itself. So you go out to the forums. Are other people seeing this problem, right? So I don't know, I've got a table view in my application and suddenly it's like off to the left of the screen, right? Like what's going on there? I've got some really basic auto layout rules that put it on the screen. Is this me? Get on the forums, check it out, see what other people are seeing. If it's an iOS 9 problem or a new version of iOS problem, other people will run into that and they'll be saying that. And you can submit bug reports to Apple and then try later betas. But as you get to those late stage betas, like for a new full version, new major release of iOS, it usually goes, like you said, I think 4 or 5. You don't know what it's going to go, but it usually goes in that range. When you get down to that 4 and that 5, it's probably something in your application. And if you've got the resources, try to do that before it comes out. And then install that GM like the day it comes out, right? You really want to get that GM installed, check it out, because you're not going to have long before your users are running into that. So, early betas, maybe it's not your problem. Later betas, it's probably going to be your problem. And then check out that GM and try to get it, out there as fast as you can. And then be honest with your users, right? If you miss something and people are having crashes, be like, yo, we found the problem. We submitted an app to the App Store. We asked Apple to expedite it. We told them it's a crashing bug. They'll listen when you say like, hey, my app is crashing, right? I tried to do an expedited bug once for like, the icon was wrong, and they're like, yeah, no, never mind. But if you're like, hey, my app crashes every time my users do something, they might listen to you, expedite that review, and get your app out there and get it fixed. So just do what you can do, but try to get on those betas as soon as you can. What else? Yeah.
So with paint code, I'm not sure how much you get on the design side. So I used it as a filter for SVGs.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it could do that.
Well, that was my question. I didn't know if it made a difference if you design natively in paint code or filter through it. But I guess.
No, honestly, I've only used paint code like at the very, very like basic level. I've been trying to dig into it and see if it's something I want to try to use more of. But I've done like the tutorials they have out there, and they've got some super cool stuff for like parameterizing your images. I don't know if you've seen that. Really cool stuff, but I'm not familiar with like the SVG filtering.
Yeah, you can pull an SVG right into it.
Okay.
But since I'm not familiar with the development side, I don't know if it's useful at all in the code that it spits out.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It probably, I mean, this is just a guess on my part, it probably doesn't spit out that much different code because when you're drawing in paint code, you're drawing a vector drawing, and you're exporting code. And that is one of the concerns I have with paint code. The code is like crazy looking, right? Because it's doing, when paint code is taking a vector drawing and turning it into code. In code, we have what's called, I'm gonna use a big word here, a Bezier path. And that's just a fancy word for a curve that can go anywhere, right? And so you're drawing all these curves and it's stitching together these Bezier paths. And that's really what it's dumping out, is all these Bezier paths. So when you go to read the code that paint code like puts out, it's not something that you want to then really work on the code. You really want to think as paint code as the source, and the code that it spits out is really generated code, which I mean, I try to avoid generated code, but it is kind of neat what it does. I would look at, you know, with a sharp eye what it's producing, and if you really want to get that in your application. But it is super cool. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. What's up? What's next? Anybody? Yeah.
You mentioned that in iOS you're required to use in-app purchases for anything you buy, and you also mentioned you work a lot on e-commerce apps. How do you build an e-commerce app? Say you're building the app for Walmart, and how do you deal with the requirement for in-app purchases if you're buying a product?
Yeah. So the question was about in-app purchases and the requirement to use that for native applications. So the requirement for in-app purchases is for digital purchases, anything non-physical. So if they're going to download a book, if they're going to download a music or a file, whatever have you, anything that you might download that's non-physical, it has to go through in-app purchase. In-app purchase, conversely, cannot be used for physical purchases. Not only do they allow you not to use it, they don't want you to use it. I don't know why that is. Maybe they don't want to get in the business of returns and all that stuff, but you can freely, Walmart can freely develop an app that if you're buying something physical, take that credit card however they want, process it, and send the products to the user. It's just a digital restriction. So if you look at the Kindle app, that's the best example. Of course, Kindle is all digital, right? You're downloading these books. You cannot go into the Kindle iOS app and buy a book from in there. Apple would get a cut of that if they did it. So they said, no, we don't want Apple to do a cut. We're willing not to put in-app purchases in to get around that. So it's really a digital versus physical thing. Great question, though. Yes? Yeah, I actually haven't done anything that used Apple Pay to take payment yet. I think users will be fine with it, especially people who own iPhones. I think they trust Apple. I think Apple really concentrates on developing that trust with their users. So I think people will trust Apple Pay probably above most other things, but not everybody's going to use it. I don't think most people have a problem, putting a credit card in an application or using PayPal or any other payment networks. Yeah, so I try to avoid the PCI conversation altogether, right? There are SDKs that you can use where the credit card goes to a third party and you don't process the credit card yourself. You kind of get like a payment token back. You never actually get that credit card. It's kind of like Apple Pay in that way, right? Yeah, maybe. I think Stripe can do that kind of stuff, right? I like Stripe a lot. I think it's super, super cool. But yeah, I don't want to deal with that PCI data unless I absolutely have to. Right, yeah. So yeah, I'll let Stripe do it, let Apple Pay do it, let somebody else do it, unless you just like really super have to do that. Absolutely. Yeah, good point. Awesome. What else? Yeah. Okay, so I think the question was, and I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to try to understand. I think the question was that you have an app, and it needs to make a whole bunch of API calls, and each of those individual calls are quick, but together they're not fast, right? So my first question would be, do you have to wait for them all to complete before you can show anything?
Kind of, yes.
Yeah? Well, yeah, I mean, you've got a tough problem to solve. If you really need that serial flow where they all have to complete before you can show anything, then you're going to need like a really nice, high quality spinner to show the user. Yeah.
I've had kind of an issue like that before. The best thing I had done, for example, if you're like with YouTube API, for example, data API, if you have the ability to predetermine what information you're going to require from them, so then you don't have to do a live API call to them. You can run an API caching method and cache the data in your database, so that when the user calls it, it doesn't have to make an external call to the data that's required.
Yeah, that's true. If you're gathering up a bunch of stuff and then you're going to make a bunch of calls, as you gather the pieces of information you need for some calls, you could be making those in the background and caching those.
You could save current calls so that in the future it's cached away.
All right.
Or you can make caching calls, say overnight or 24 hours a day, so it's gathering information.
Yeah. Then there's a URL cache that can cache stuff, and then there's also NS cache where you can choose what you want to cache, and you can make that persistent on disk. It may be wiped out by the OS if their device is full, but it may be there. So there's a couple caching. That's a great call out. 2 more questions, I think.
More on the UX side of the experience. If you are waiting for something to load, check, like if you're logging to Facebook.com on your browser or even on your mobile app, usually they load like a skeleton that has no content, it's like gray scale. But that's where issue will be and that's where the test will be. It feels like things are loading faster than they are because it is loading anything, just not the.
Yeah. Yeah, make sure your app is doing something to let the user know it's not frozen, especially. And start loading a skeleton, show a really cool spinner on top of that, something like that. And really, see if there's portions that you can make concurrent where you could show even part of the data. Even if they can't interact with it yet, if they start seeing stuff come in, that can be helpful. So I think we said 2 more questions. Anybody else? Yeah.
Our iOS guys, they've asked us to provide PDFs and using Xcode to auto-generate PNGs and they're developing everything at a 1x size and then using Xcode to leverage that, or leverage Xcode to generate 1x, 2x, 3x.
Uh-huh.
I have no idea if that's a real thing. I just kind of hand off stuff and it auto-magically happens.
Okay.
Is that something you've had experience with, or is?
So I think the question was that your developers are asking for the assets in a PDF format, and then they're generating the PNGs that they need through Xcode at the various scales that they need. I haven't done that. I honestly, I'll be honest, I don't know if that's a real thing or not. I'm assuming it probably is. I have not used that. I'm not a Photoshop master. I kind of like my graphics either cut or give me Sketch things and I'll export them because Sketch has really cool workflow for exporting in those various sizes too. But I haven't done that PDF thing. It sounds familiar, but I have not done it. I don't know if anybody else in the room has. Yeah.
But if I'm working in, say, Illustrator, for example, I'm working in a vector base. You're keeping the vector.
Yeah.
Everything's at 1x, so it infinitely scales.
Yeah, that's typically done is to work at that 1x resolution and then scale it up for whatever size that you need. And the advantage of working at 1x is that you don't have problems cutting it down, right? If you develop at 2x and you make something 81 pixels wide, what's the 1x version? it's a half pixel and now it's going to look blurry and it's not going to look cool, right? So that I think that's why you're developing at 1x. Yeah, and some people now are developing at 2x and just making sure everything's even, just because that's kind of the way they think. But yeah, I think 1x is kind of the way to go. But I don't know anything about that PDF thing. It sounds cool. And if it can get you away from, you know, cutting assets, I'm sure you love it. But Sketch can do that too, which is super cool. You should check that out. But yeah, I don't know anything about the PDF. I'm gonna check it out now. Actually, it sounds awesome. I think we have one more. Anybody else? Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, iOS 9 comes along and introduces something super, super cool you want to use. There's a couple different strategies you can do for that, right? So we've got metrics in all of our applications that tell us what versions people are using, and we can track that. Crashlytics, which is now part of Fabric, which is owned by Twitter, and then Google Analytics can tell you these things. So you want to track, you know, what your users are actually running. I think one of the apps I work on now, we see about, you know, like still like 60 to 70 people a day using iOS 7. But the vast majority using iOS 9, and then iOS 10 I think is kind of, or not 10, iOS 8 is kind of a smaller subset. So if you've got an application out there already, you can look at your metrics and kind of evaluate things, and you can decide to bump it up a version. We could drop iOS 7 in that product, and only a few people would be disrupted, and if they really liked our app, they may upgrade to iOS 8 or iOS 9. Again, they couldn't really update to 8 now. They'd have to go to 9, but they may do that. So focus on your metrics if you're out there. If you're shipping a new application, a lot of times you can get away with just the newest platform, right? It's got major adoption if it's been out for a while. The vast majority of our users are on iOS 9 for all of our apps. There is still a lot of support for iOS 8. So if you're an app that's current, that's been out there and people have been using it, definitely like 2 versions, right? So iOS 8, iOS 9, you know, that's kind of a given, and then you can probably drop off each major version as the next one come out and been out a while. Use your metrics to evaluate that and see what's happening. And then if there's a super, super shiny new feature that you want to use, you can still use it in your application, and you can put guardrails around it so an iOS 7 or an iOS 8 user is not going to see that, or alter them, offer them an alternative experience that maybe isn't as good. That's extra work for your developers and your designers, but you can say, okay, if it's iOS 9, do this thing. If it's iOS 8, you know, do that thing. I've done that recently with I'm going to get the syntax wrong, but there's a new web view in iOS 9 that's only in iOS 9, and it's kind of a super cool way to embed, you know, web pages now. It's a little better. So I needed to put a web view in an application, and I thought the new one was compelling enough to do it both ways, right? I did the iOS 9 way, and I did the iOS 8 way. And so if you're on iOS 8, you see the old stuff. If you're on iOS 9, you see the new things. But that's if it's like super compelling, you want to get into it right away. But 2 major versions, definitely. Look at your metrics, and then as a new version comes out, you know, watch what happens to that. You know, that was your second one, now is your third one. Watch what happens with that, and if there's something getting you to move, then move when that drops off. Don't just move to move, though, right? If you don't have a reason, don't just be like, oh, I'm going to drop iOS 7 tomorrow. You know, look at the metrics, look at what you want to do that you would gain if you didn't have to support it anymore, and then make the move. Make it kind of a cognitive thing. And then, you know, look at your users. I used to work on an app in kind of like the enterprise space, and our users adopted much, much slower. And instead of 2 major versions, we were a 3 major version shop, which was not fun. But look at those user habits too. Awesome question, thanks. And I think that's it. Thanks. And I know Kevin.